Content warning. This story includes depictions of domestic violence and homophobic abuse. Snow came down like glass that night, hard and cold enough to bite the windshield into 1,000 tiny stars. The lane outside Holloway's farmhouse was a thread of black between white fields, the headlights cutting a tunnel through the storm. Robert Holloway drove like a man whose hands were made to hold the wheel and nothing else, rigid, determined, and already past whatever mercy had once lived in him. Finn stumbled in the glare, his breath a ragged cloud that vanished into the storm. The door of the truck had slammed. The world around him smelled of exhaust and the faint metallic tang of fear. He was 21 and half-dressed for winter, as if someone had taken his coat and left him 2 sizes short of a story that matched his life. He pressed his back to the ditch and rocked, the howl of the wind swallowing the small sounds he might have managed to make. Robert leaned into the cab, face thrown into shadow by the light. He shouted, something about shame and sin, words that landed like thrown stones. He opened the passenger door and pushed. The push meant something heavier than the cold. Finn's shoulder hit the snow, his hands dug at the road as if at a place that could catch him. Someone's last look before disappearing left him with the shape of a man walking away, and the knowledge that whoever walked would not return. The truck vanished into the white. Headlights retreated and then were gone. Finn lay in the shoulder of the road and watched the snow fill the prints his fall had made. For a while he only listened. The old radio at the farmhouse 3/4 mile distant. The groan of a signboard somewhere in the field. The wind as it pushed snow up in little waves. His fingers were numb. His coat lay somewhere on the road behind him. A gift box he'd been carrying, wrapping paper bright with holly, rolled a few feet and stopped against a fence post. He hoped no one would ever find it, and for reasons he couldn't name, he also hoped someone would. 3 miles the other way, Jackson Ryder drove his old paper up with a careful, heavy hand. He had the radio low, a country station muffled under the weather. The pickup smelled like cedar and old coffee, and the aftertaste of a life that had narrowed since Daniel died. Daniel's laugh lived in the space between the 2 seats, in the dent where a hand had once rested. Jackson had meant to be home early that night. Simple stew on the stove, a tree half decorated, a small box wrapped in paper on the table, because old habits died slower than grief. He turned the truck through the storm, thinking about whether to drag the tree inside now or wait until morning. Then the highway offered him something that could be seen only when the world grew thin. A shape by the roadside, small, hunched like a question. Jackson pulled off with the soft, efficient motion of someone used to sudden decisions.
The tires found snow, sank, and crunched. He left the engine running and stepped out into the wind, hat pulled down, collar up. The light from the pickup painted the figure in streaks. For a long second, Jackson thought it might be a deer or a drift of branches. Then the shape moved. "Hey," he called, and his voice broke cold wind into warm pockets. "Hey, you okay?" The man on the shoulder looked up with eyes like burned matchsticks. Blood had dried at the corner of his lip. A bruise bloomed purple under his jaw. He was young, too young to be compiled into grief and broken things. He made no sound for a moment, then reached for the words as if they were something fragile. "My name's Finn," he said. The name came out in a small, raw syllable. He blinked and then closed his eyes like the expression was a choice you could make to protect yourself from being seen any further. Jackson crouched because the snow was knee-deep and because he wanted to be nearer the ground Finn occupied, nearer to what had just been done. He offered his gloved hand. "Come on," he said. "Get in." He wrapped a borrowed blanket around Finn in the cab, pressed the heater on high, and poured coffee into a paper cup because the farmhouse by the main road felt farther than it should. Finn's hands trembled around the cup. He drank like someone taking in oxygen. Slowly came the story, short sentences broken up by shivers, silence that said more than words. Robert Holloway had found out Finn was gay. He would not accept it, declared the father. He had called Finn shameful. He had accused. He had slapped. He had pushed him out of the house. He had driven off and left him there. "I didn't do nothing," Finn said once, voice muffled by the blanket. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't do anything wrong," Jackson answered, and the words were heavier and truer than any sermon. Jackson's jaw tightened around the name that would haunt him, Daniel, because Daniel would have known how to say it in a way that belonged to the world rather than against it. He thought of Daniel's studio with its jars of brushes, of the smell of linseed oil and coffee, of the day they'd found an old postcard of Venice and laughed and wrote each other's names on it like a promise. "How'd you end up out here?" Jackson asked, carefully professional in the way of men who had once worn uniforms and had been taught to keep things clean. The answer was a single syllable: thrown. Thrown out. Abandoned at the edge of everything Finn had known. Jackson turned the pickup back toward the hollow of his farmhouse. Finn was a small thing under the blanket that smelled faintly of rust and wet cotton. The highway lights behind them clawed at the snow. They drove in silence except for the radio, the steady click of the defroster, and the breath of Finn, which grew less ragged as the heater fought the cold from his limbs.
When they reached Jackson's house, the door opened the way homes do to certain people, because he had lived alone long enough to leave one place open in case someone needed it. Inside was warm in a way the storm outside had no language for. Old quilts folded on a chair, the kitchen table with a single place left marked by an old mug, and at the far end of the back room, Daniel's studio. Paint sat dry in tubes. Canvases leaned against the wall like questions waiting for answers. Jackson set 2 plates on the table and warmed stew. Finn sat at the table, hands wrapped around his mug, watching. He watched the way Jackson moved, the careful, slow practice of someone who had held others' lives in his hands and had come to understand his own hands carried a new meaning now. "Do you have anyone else?" Jackson asked. It was not a social question. It was a line cast in case there might be an anchor to. "No," Finn said. I told him. It was a fight. He said, his voice cut. He swallowed something salt. He said I ought to leave. He said I'd bring shame to the family. Jackson laid a towel at Finn's feet, dried the edges of a chipped mug, and offered the jacket Daniel had left. The leather fit like an apology. Finn slid his arms into it and breathed in the smell of Daniel's cologne mixed with cedar and smoke. For a moment, his face softened to something both fragile and alive. Outside, a car idled on the county road. A figure sat inside, hands wrapped around a steering wheel as if holding a position he had held for a long time. He watched the little drama from the other side of the storm. The truck returning, the light that glowed from the house, the figure who climbed out and went inside. The man in the car wore an ordinary coat and an expression shaped by a life where ordinary had come to mean power. His name was Silas Voss. He had been in town less than a day, and yet he had the look of someone who had learned to read a scene quickly. He had no business intervening in the way the sheriff or law or a neighbor might, but he kept his engine running and made a note of a license plate number he'd seen in the snow earlier. He watched because sometimes the world presented him with a wrong he could not ignore, and watching was the first choice. In the kitchen, Jackson made a call to the sheriff. Sheriff Miller's voice when he picked up had the steady cadence of a man who had seen more than he would ever say aloud. He said the right thing. "We'll come by, we'll take a report." He said other things too. Practicalities about warming up, about checking for injuries, about what to tell Finn about his options. Jackson told Miller the facts as briefly and tightly as he could. Adult son, assaulted, abandoned, out in the snow. Finn had accepted help and was with him now. The sheriff said he would send a deputy to check Holloway's property and look for evidence of a vehicle. "I'll be there in the morning," Sheriff Miller said.
"For now, make sure he's warm. If you want to follow up, we'll get the paperwork started." "It's my house," Jackson said before he could stop himself. He didn't mean it in the way a man might claim ownership. He meant it as an offer. He can stay. Finn looked at him then with the beginning of something like relief. The future looked less like an endless ditch and more like a room with a door. It was a small mercy, but it was real, and it was chosen. If the scene at the roadside had been about abandonment, the scene in the cottage was about rescue. Finn slept on the couch with an old blanket wrapped round, the jacket zipped to his chin. Jackson kept watch at the edge of everything grief taught him. He checked the thermostat, moved a pillow, set a pot of coffee by the door. He woke sometimes to the memory of Daniel laughing at the radio, and to the new reality of the young man sleeping on his couch. When the sheriff arrived in the morning, the world had cleared enough to see tracks in the snow, prints where 2 hands had clutched at the roadside, the indent of a small body where it had tried to curl itself into nothing. The deputy found the wrapping paper box stuck under a fence post. That small, bright shape became an evidentiary detail in a case that would not be neatly resolved by a single night. The deputy called it what it was: reckless endangerment, assault,
an offense aggravated by the weather and the father's choice to leave him there. Sheriff Miller spoke with Robert Holloway at his farmhouse. The old preacher's voice, when it spoke, could be convincing in a small town, where tradition and an idea of righteousness held a great deal of weight. He told the deputy that Finn had left of his own accord. He told the deputy he had only asked Finn to go and had not struck him. The deputy took notes. The law does not always distinguish easily between what a man intends in his chest and what his fists do. Later that day, when someone rang Jackson's doorbell, Jackson opened it to a man in a suit who carried the hush of someone who was not a neighbor. He introduced himself as a local lawyer sent by the county to advise about adult coercion laws and protective orders. The man was practical and matter-of-fact. He explained that Finn, being 21, could press charges, but that the most likely immediate relief would be a protective order. Criminal charges would depend on evidence and witnesses, bruises, medical records, anything that made Robert's actions undeniable. Finn listened, hands wrapped around a cup. He was clear about one thing. He did not want to be shuffled into a system that would treat him like a problem to be managed rather than a person. He wanted to press charges, but he wanted to do it on his terms. He wanted control again. "I'll help," Jackson said. "I'll be there." Finn nodded. He accepted the help, and in that acceptance, something shifted.
It was not rescue in the sense of needing to be saved. It was rescue in the sense of being allowed to exist in the same world as someone who would stand with him. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow return. The town's guilt peeled away in the small acts that make up a community: a pot of soup on a neighbor's step, a high school friend offering a job lead, a church volunteer arranging temporary space at the shelter. Finn painted again in Daniel's studio, beginning with small things: the way the light hit a mug, a field of snow seen from the porch, and at night he dreamed less of ghosts and more of something like a future. The father, Robert, appeared in court. He pleaded at first with the hope that a judge's ears would accept his version of himself. He said he had acted in the name of faith. The court clerk read the charges: reckless endangerment, assault. The judge placed conditions: a protective order, mandatory counseling, and an order of no contact with Finn. The case moved slowly through paperwork and hearings. The town watched in the way a small place watches things. There were conversations at the diner, an awkward silence at church, and an undercurrent of fatigue in people who had learned to live with imperfect justice. Meanwhile, Silas Voss sat in his rented room 2 towns over and made a decision that felt like a purchase. He had seen the man by the road and had memorized the truck's partial plate. He had other people he could call, resources that could move things in small, practical ways. He made a call to the sheriff anonymously, vague but with a detail that mattered: the direction the truck had gone, the way its muffler clipped twice. That call, it turned out, was a small thing that slotted into the deputy's work like a missing tooth. Sheriff Miller and his team followed the trail. They found Holloway's truck tucked in the edge of his yard, snow packed in the wheel wells. Under further questioning, the story changed, and a charge grew more solid. Silas didn't show up in the courtroom or hand anyone a check in person. When Finn later received an envelope at the shelter, contained inside was a note with no signature and a contribution towards his legal fund. The money came by way of a foundation unknown to them, delivered to a lawyer who preferred to remain unnamed. The gift fixed practical problems, paying for additional legal work so Finn had a proper advocate, and paying for therapy. There was a moral thrum under the ease of it. Money doesn't absolve, and no one on the receiving end pretended otherwise. But the funds gave Finn options that otherwise might have been clouded by paperwork, and options gave him agency. Jackson walked the line between gratitude and caution. He knew who had left the money before Finn ever saw the note. He saw the car the night of the assault on a roadside routine in his mind, and the man behind the wheel had an air of controlled distance.
Jackson's life had lived in the shadow of favors once. He had seen the way favors could buy silence or turn pages without justice. He had also seen the way favors could be used to put a person where they could be safe. He did not glorify the source. He accepted the help as a patch in a larger system that still needed repair. There were days when Finn's trauma sat heavy in the room, like a closed door that one could not open all the way. He woke with a taste of winter in his mouth. He watched the road as if expecting to see the truck again. He flinched at doors. He had vivid dreams in which Robert's face hovered like an accusation. Therapy helped, but did not fix everything. Jackson learned to sit with Finn's silences and to wait for the small openings, a laugh over a badly burnt toast, the way Finn's shoulders eased when a canvas came out finished. The studio began to fill with pieces, silent landscapes at first, then portraits that felt like a conversation. Finn painted a piece of Jackson drying a mug in the sink, the light catching the back of his neck. He painted Daniel's old chair empty,
except for the patch where his lighter had once rested. He painted the little gift box he'd found at the roadside, wrapped now in something less fragile, a painting that folded the outside world into a square and made it something Finn could carry. That winter, the town itself did something small. A drive at the community center collected winter coats and handed them over to the shelter. Jackson and Finn volunteered to sort through jackets, to wrap donation boxes with tape, and write little notes that said, "You are seen." People who had not known how to speak to the issue of abuse found their language in concrete gestures: gloves, blankets, hot meals. The community did not fix the problem of homophobia, but it loosened the tightness around those who had been pushed out into the cold. Robert Holloway's consequences were not cinematic justice. He did not find himself at the mercy of a vengeance crew or ruined by a single heroic act. He was instead prosecuted and ordered into counseling. He lost standing in certain local committees. People who had once relied on his sermons found other pews easier to sit in. The court put in place a restraining order. The law worked in its slow, clumsy way, acknowledging harm but never capturing the shape of the wound entirely. Finn's lawyer pressed charges, documented injuries, gathered witnesses. There were statements, depositions, and days when Finn had to sit across a table and recount what had been done to him. It was a hard kind of courage. Through it all, Jackson never framed himself as a savior. He understood the difference between someone who saves and someone who keeps a light on. He kept the lights on. He made dinners, adjusted blankets, washed paint from cups, and fixed the leaking faucet. He did not take Finn's story from him or speak for him in court without consent.
When Finn wanted to keep a detail private, Jackson kept it private. When Finn wanted to press charges, Jackson was in the room with him, but Finn said the words. The moral complication of Silas Voss remained a small, luminous shadow in the background. He was not the sort to show up at a holiday potluck and explain himself. In the end, his intervention was as clean and as messy as any practical kindness. An anonymous tip, a discreet wire through a legitimate nonprofit, a note left at the attorney's office with no signature. The town would later whisper theories, some darker, some kinder, but the truth rested with Finn. He had been helped in ways that did not make him beholden. He had been offered tools, not commands. Spring came on a thaw, and with it a slow folding back in of things none of them wanted to let go of. Finn painted on canvases that grew larger as his hands grew steadier. He worked and painted and kept a job at the hardware store, stacking wood and measuring up shelves. The shelter that had taken a bundle of blankets that first snow now had a box at the county roadside filled with supplies, blankets, a thermos, a note on top that read simply, "Take what you need." Jackson and Finn built the box one afternoon with no fanfare, the kind of small, sturdy construction that spoke of the future rather than of any one night. One evening, Jackson found Finn in the studio looking at a finished piece, a portrait of Jackson standing at the sink, towel over his shoulder, the light in the painting catching the curve of his hand. Finn's face was lit in the soft glow of the lamp. He had written a small dedication on the back, "For keeping the light." Finn turned to Jackson. "I wanted to give this to you," he said. "You don't have to ching it if you don't want to." Jackson's throat tightened, and the joke that had always been between them caught in his chest. He picked up the canvas and cradled it the way one might cradle a newborn bird. "I like it," Jackson said. He was not eloquent about feelings. He showed them. He showed steadiness and constancy, and the ways that grief could be a point from which you pivoted rather than a place you remained. In the months after the arrest, Finn tested the waters of relationships and trust. He reconnected with a friend he'd been afraid to see. He went to therapy and made a plan to present his art at a small gallery in town, the kind of local space that smelled of coffee and varnish and possibility. He chose to press charges all the way through the preliminary hearings, not because he wanted punishment, but because he wanted the record to say he had been wronged, and that the wrong had consequences. It wasn't revenge, it was definition. When the day came that the judge signed off on a protective order and set a preliminary hearing date for the assault charge, there were no photographers, no dramatic statements. There was a courtroom clerk stamping papers, a lawyer shifting in his seat, and the hollow relief of someone whose voice had finally reached an official ledger. The father was ordered to complete a course in anger management, to attend counseling, and to stay away from Finn. The community's whispering softened into a hum. The legal system had done what small-town law could do, without pretending to be everything. Silas Voss never placed himself center stage. One night, late, Jackson found an envelope at his porch with no return address. Inside was a short, plain note.
Use when a hand is needed. No expectation. S. Beneath it was a check with an amount that could buy time and legal counsel, but not a silence. Jackson understood exactly what that meant. A resource without strings, an intervention without spectacle. He folded the note and placed it in the top drawer of the kitchen table, where receipts and small things went. He did not call the number on the check. He did not send a thank you. He let the act be what it was, an ambiguous kindness. The end of the year felt like a soft thing. They did not have a ceremony for healing. Instead, there were dinners and the sound of a radio at low volume and the smell of oil paint and wood glue and stew. Finn and Jackson put up a tree, the two of them, a small thing in a corner of the living room with a string of worn lights and paper ornaments. They wrapped a small box and put it under the tree. Inside it was a print of Finn's earliest painting in months, a field of light that somehow made the cold look like a memory rather than a place to be. They spoke sometimes of Daniel in the way people speak of those who have changed the contour of their lives, with affection that did not demand anything of the present except gratitude. Jackson turned the studio over to Finn to do with as he wished. Finn opened it to small classes, kids from town who had looked at a blank sheet of paper and said they had no story to tell. The classes became a place where new things happened, where an anxious kid could smear paint and discover a color they liked. There were awkward moments still. A preacher who had once sided with Holloway delivered a sermon that tasted of uncertainty and apology. Some people nodded, and some people left the pew. The father, Robert, had days of what looked like contrition intermingled with stubbornness. He could be seen sometimes in the distance at the hardware store, buying a roll of tape, looking as if he wanted to ask for something and did not know how. On the porch in a late afternoon of thaw, Jackson and Finn stood watching the light go long across the yard. Finn had a mug in his hands. The portrait of Jackson, hung now on the kitchen wall, caught a slant of gold and made the whole room softer. The world outside was still messy. Justice had landed in places and left scars unhealed.
But there was something else now, a household where someone kept the light on, and where the light acknowledged those who had once been thrown out. "You're staying, right?" Jackson said quietly. It wasn't a question of demand. It was a question asking if the life they'd begun to build was real. Finn looked out toward the road. He had been pushed into the cold and found a way back. He had chosen to step into the studio and to paint his way through a memory that once had been nothing but ache. "Yeah," he said, "I'm staying." And then he added, because language matters and he wanted Jackson to know the shape of it, "I want to build something here, not just for me, for others, for anyone who gets left at the side of the road." Jackson nodded, because that is how you answer when someone hands you something like hope. He wrapped an arm around Finn, and they stood that way for a long time, two people leaning into a quiet life like two posts supporting an old porch. In time, the roadside box grew a little more substantial. A thermos bolted in place, a folded tarp, a stack of blankets, a handful of phone numbers taped inside the lid. It was a practical gesture and a promise. For those who passed through, there would be a small place to catch their breath. Finn painted the outside of the box a bright, visible color and stenciled a simple message: "Take what you need." Justice had come through legal channels that were neither immediate nor perfectly satisfying. There had been a restraining order, a small fine, counseling for Robert Holloway, and the public knowledge that his actions had consequences. There had also been help from someone whose name belonged to no one in particular, a man who sat in his car and watched, who later nudged the machinery of law into motion with a phone call and a check through a lawyer. None of it made the violence worth anything. None of it replaced what had been taken, but it created safety. Months later, at a small show at the little gallery downtown, Finn hung a series called Shelter. The paintings were not dramatic. They were honest. A field in winter, a mug on a table, a pair of hands cupping a cup. The last painting was a portrait of Jackson, and the plaque beneath read simply, "For keeping the light." People came and pressed their faces to the glass, and some of them bought small works. The proceeds went to a local youth shelter. Silas Voss was mentioned only in rumor. People liked to invent arcs where the powerful man either saved the weak or exposed himself as another villain. The truth, quiet and messy, was that he had done something small and complicated. He had made it possible for a man to afford the counsel he needed, and left them without explanation. Finn never thanked him directly. He accepted the help and spent it on legal work and a few months of therapy,
and he turned those months into paintings. At night, sometimes Finn dreamt that Robert Holloway was at the edge of some field, asking for forgiveness.
Dreams are not contracts, but Finn learned to tell himself that forgiveness did not mean letting go of the record of harm. It meant, perhaps, keeping the ledger honest and not letting rage become what made his life. On a late afternoon when the light fell long across the yard and the wind had lost its bite, Jackson and Finn sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee between them. They had, over time, the look of people who had learned how to belong on purpose. Finn reached across and touched Jackson's hand, his fingers soft with paint. "Thanks for driving," he said. Jackson smiled, small and weathered. "You had the better coat," he said, and the joke landed, and both of them laughed. The chosen family they formed was not perfect. It was a scaffolding of steady things: warmth on a cold night, a listening ear, the readiness to stand up in court when someone needed a witness, the humility to accept help, and the caution to keep hold of one's own story. The Mafia boss who had watched from his car remained a shadowed presence. His aid was not a redemptive crusade, but a practical hand extended without ceremony. It was enough, because enough for them meant safety and time to heal. There was one last small gesture that felt like a seal on that imperfect mercy. A year after the night in the snow, a child came into Finn's studio carrying a small painting, a snowman with a crooked smile. The child asked if Finn would teach him how to make the snow look like it was moving. Finn took the brush, set it on the canvas, and showed the child how to create the suggestion of wind with a single stroke. Then he added another stroke and another, and the painting began to breathe. They hung the child's picture next to a larger one, the roadside box painted bright and open. People stopped by the studio over the holidays. They stood under the tree, wrapped a gift for someone who could not be with their family, and left a donation in a box that was then brought to the shelter. When the final snow of that winter began to fall, it was not as sharp as the night Finn had spent by the road. It fell like a soft apology, or a blank page. Jackson and Finn stood at the window and watched together. "Remember Daniel?" Finn asked suddenly, and the way he asked let Jackson know that the memory had room to breathe. "I do," Jackson said. "I miss him every day." They stood there in the quiet, two people with histories that had bent toward one another, two people who had chosen to keep the light on. Outside, the road was quiet, and there were fewer footprints. Inside, the lamp threw a pool of warmth across the wooden floor. A portrait of a man drying a mug hung on the wall, and a small anonymous note sat in Jackson's drawer. The world beyond the porch did not change into a fairer place overnight. There were still people who would judge, who would choose rejection over love. But there were also small practices of kindness, and a community that had learned in its own slow way to hold a space for those who had once been left at the side of the road. Finn had reclaimed his art. Jackson had found a way to love again without losing himself to it. And the man who had sat in the car and watched had driven away, weaving a trail of questions and a few concrete things that helped a young man stay warm. On the last page of the year, Finn framed the painting of the roadside box and set it in the studio window. It caught the sun at noon and flashed color across the yard like a promise. He had been thrown out into the snow and found a house. He had been pushed to the edge and chosen, with a trembling heart, to step back into the world and to create something steady from the shards. In the quiet of the room, fingers stained with paint, he folded a small note and placed it inside the frame. The note read only, "For those who need a hand." He closed the frame and set it on the wall. Outside, the world was not finished. Inside, a kettle sang and a radio played soft. A man stood at the sink and dried a mug. Another prepared brushes. The chosen family kept the light on. The snow melted a little at a time, and the road that had once been a place of abandonment became, piece by piece, a road back. If anyone asked what to do when someone was left at the hand of a cruel world, Finn and Jackson could say, simply and fiercely, "Bring them in, warm them up, help them find their voice, and stand with them while the law does what it can." The rest, the slow and hard work of rebuilding, happened in small acts repeated long enough to become a life. If this story matters to you, please consider subscribing for more stories like this. If you can, consider supporting local LGBTQ+ youth services, links in the description, to help ensure no one has to stand alone at the roadside.